On a freezing cold morning in November of 2019, workers from a construction company in Cedar Falls, Iowa, were preparing themselves to demolish an old farm that had been abandoned for decades. The property, situated on rural Route 47, was scheduled to give way to a new residential condominium complex. But when John Martinez's excavator plunged 3.5 meters into the compacted soil behind the collapsed barn, the metal claws encountered something that would make anyone's blood freeze. A military chest made of olive green metal of the type used during the Korean War emerged from the earth with an inscription almost erased by time: Sergeant D.A. Reynolds, U.S. Army, 1953. What was inside that chest, buried at 3 meters and 60 centimeters of depth on a farm long forgotten, would reveal clues about one of the most disturbing disappearances in the history of Cedar Falls. And it would raise even more questions about what really happened to David Andrew Reynolds on one October night in 1959. 60 years of silence were about to be broken, but the truth would remain as buried as that chest had been for 6 decades. If you enjoy cases that defy explanations, that dive into the shadows of American history and make us question everything we think we know about ordinary people, you are in the right place. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because today we are going to explore every disturbing detail of this case. And I promise that what we will discover in the next 3 decades goes far beyond what anyone in Cedar Falls could have imagined on that October night of 1959. This is the story of David Reynolds, a war hero, a dedicated son, a man who simply disappeared like smoke on an autumn night, and of a military chest that kept its secrets for 60 years. David Andrew Reynolds was born on the 23rd of April, 1931 in Cedar Falls, Iowa, only child of Margaret and Andrew Reynolds. He was a boy with dark brown hair that fell rebelliously over his forehead, bright green eyes that his mother said were the same green as the cornfields in June, and a smile that, according to everyone who knew him, illuminated any environment. With 1 meter and 78 centimeters in height and athletic build, David had that calm presence that made people feel safe around him. David's childhood was typical of rural America in the 1930s and 40s. He grew up on the family farm, a property of 20 hectares that produced mainly corn and raised cattle. Every day before school, David would wake up at 5 in the morning to help his father milk the cows and feed the animals. He never complained, never asked to stay longer in bed. His father used to say that David had the work ethic ingrained in his DNA. At Cedar Falls High School, David was known not only for his consistently high grades in mathematics and history, but for his gentle and protective nature. He had a small but loyal group of friends. Every Saturday night, David and his colleagues would meet at Mel's Diner, a local restaurant on Main Street that served the best chocolate milkshakes in the county. Susan Hartley, who was David's classmate and still lived in Cedar Falls in 2019, remembered with tears in her eyes. David was the type of boy who would carry your books if you had your hands full, who defended the weaker ones. Once he stopped some bullies from tormenting a younger boy. David was not confrontational by nature, but he had a very clear moral line. But David's life would change drastically in June of 1950, a few months after his graduation. The Korean War broke out, and in September of that year, at 19 years old, David enlisted in the United States Army. It was not an act of blind patriotism or search for adventure. In a letter he wrote to his mother at the time, preserved to this day by the family, David explained, "Mother, I know this is going to break your heart, but I need to do this. Men are dying there. Families are being destroyed. If I can make a difference, even if small, I need to try. It's what Dad would do." Margaret Reynolds kept that letter close to her chest throughout the entire war, reading it every night before going to sleep. David served in Korea from November of 1950 until July of 1953, reaching the rank of sergeant. He rarely spoke about what he saw there, but the letters he sent home painted the portrait of a young man struggling to maintain his humanity amid horror. "Today, I helped a Korean family rebuild the wall of their house," he wrote in February of 1952. "The youngest girl cannot be more than 5 years old, gave me a drawing. She drew a flower. In the middle of all this destruction, she can still see flowers." When David returned to Cedar Falls in August of 1953, at 22 years old, he was different, quieter, more thoughtful. But according to those who knew him well, he was still fundamentally the same kind and hard-working David. He had that look that many veterans brought with them, that distance in the eyes that suggested that a part of them was still on some distant battlefield. But David made a conscious effort to reconnect with life in Cedar Falls. He took over the administration of the family farm when his father Andrew suffered a mild stroke in 1954. David transformed that into a personal mission. He would wake up at 4:30 in the morning, work in the fields until nightfall, care for the animals with an almost religious dedication. The farm prospered under his management. Neighbors commented that David had a blessed hand for the land. But David was not only a farmer. On Sunday afternoons, he gave voluntary mathematics lessons to children with difficulties at the local church, the First Methodist Church on Parkway Avenue. Reverend Elizabeth Morrison, who at the time was pastoral assistant and was still alive in 2010 when she gave her last interview about the case, remembered David had infinite patience with those children. He explained fractions using apples from his own farm, geometry using fences and barns. He made mathematics come to life and always ended the lessons saying, "You are smarter than you think. You just need someone who believes in you." In 1957, at 26 years old, David began dating Kathy Mitchell, a 23-year-old nurse from Cedar Falls Hospital. They met when David took his mother to a routine medical appointment. Kathy was a woman with wavy blonde hair, blue eyes, and a laugh that, according to Margaret Reynolds, made David forget all the sadness he brought from the war. The relationship flourished quickly. They were seen together everywhere, at church on Sundays, at the downtown cinema every Friday night, walking hand in hand through Cedar River Park on summer afternoons. David proposed to Kathy in June of 1959 at a picnic on the banks of the Cedar River. He offered her a modest gold ring with a small stone that had belonged to his grandmother. Kathy said yes before he even finished the question. The wedding was scheduled for the 27th of November 1959, Thanksgiving Day. Margaret Reynolds had already begun making the preparations, personally sewing Kathy's wedding dress. But there was something about David in those last months of 1959 that worried those closest to him. Margaret noticed that her son seemed distracted, lost in thoughts. Kathy mentioned to friends that sometimes David would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, with that distant look that she had learned to associate with memories of the war. "He says everything is fine," Kathy confided to her best friend, Linda Shaw, "but I know something is bothering him." The weeks prior to his disappearance, David did something curious. He began organizing all his war documents, service certificates, medals, photographs, letters. He spent hours in the attic of the farmhouse examining that green military chest he had brought from Korea. When his mother asked what he was doing, David only smiled and said, "Just organizing the past, Mother. It's important to keep things in order." No one could know that those words would have such a sinister meaning just a few weeks later. Thursday, the 15th of October, 1959. The day dawned cold in Cedar Falls, with temperatures around 8 degrees Celsius. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds that promised the first real snow of the season. The leaves on the trees along rural Route 47 had assumed those deep shades of red and gold of Midwestern American autumn, and the wind made them fall in hypnotic spirals. David Reynolds woke up at 4:45 in the morning, as always. Margaret heard her son moving through the hallway, going down the wooden stairs that creaked on the third step from the top down. She heard the kitchen door open and close.
For many years afterward, she would wonder if she should have gone down that morning, if she should have prepared his coffee, if she should have had one more conversation. At 6:15 in the morning, Thomas Brennan, the nearest neighbor, whose property was about 800 meters away, saw David working in the barn. Thomas waved, and David returned the greeting. That was the last 5 Thomas saw David Reynolds. At 8:30 in the morning, Kathy Mitchell called the farm. She had worked the night shift at the hospital and wanted to hear her fiancé's voice before going to sleep. Margaret answered and said that David was in the fields, but that she would ask him to return the call. Kathy said it was not necessary, that she would speak with him later. At 10:45 in the morning, Robert Hayes, the Cedar Falls mailman, delivered mail in the Reynolds mailbox. He noticed David's red Ford F-100 pickup truck from 1956 parked near the barn, but did not see David himself. This was not uncommon. Farmers were always busy, always in motion. Noon. Margaret prepared lunch, as she always did. Vegetable soup, homemade bread, apple pie. She waited. 12:15, 12:30. At 12:45, she walked to the barn, calling for her son. The barn was empty. David's tools were organized. The tractor was parked in its usual place, but David was not there. Margaret did not panic immediately. Perhaps David had gone to check the fences in the most distant part of the property. Perhaps he had gone to town for some reason. But then she noticed something that made her heart race. David's coat, a brown wool coat that he always wore in the cold, was hanging on the hook near the kitchen door. On a day of 8 degrees, David would not go anywhere without that coat. At 2 in the afternoon, Margaret called the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Office. She spoke with Deputy Sheriff William Bill Crawford, a 42-year-old man who had known the Reynolds for decades. Margaret explained the situation, trying to keep her voice calm, but Bill could hear fear beginning to creep into her words. "Mrs. Reynolds," Bill said, in his gentle and reassuring tone, "I will send someone immediately, but I am sure there is a simple explanation. Perhaps David got a ride from someone to go to town." At 2:20 in the afternoon, Deputy Crawford and another officer arrived at the farm. They began a methodical search of the property, the barn, the main house, the fields, the stables for the cattle. They found everything in perfect order. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing except David himself. At 3:15 in the afternoon, they discovered something that would transform that search from a possible misunderstanding into something much more sinister. In the small workshop attached to the barn, where David kept smaller tools and made repairs, there were signs of disturbance. Tools that were normally organized on the workbench were scattered, and on the concrete floor, so subtle that it almost went unnoticed, there was what appeared to be some drops of a dark liquid. Deputy Crawford knelt down to examine more closely. His stomach tightened. That looked like blood. At 4 in the afternoon, Sheriff Harold Thompson personally took over the investigation. Thompson, a 53-year-old man with 30 years of experience in law enforcement, knew immediately that they were dealing with something serious. He called for reinforcements. At 4:30, a dozen officers were scouring the farm and surrounding areas. Kathy Mitchell arrived at the farm at 5:15 in the afternoon. She had woken up and called the Reynolds' house, only to discover that David was missing. She was still wearing her nurse's uniform, having left the hospital as soon as she woke up. Margaret remembered that Kathy was so pale she looked like a ghost. "Where is he?" Kathy repeated, looking at the empty fields. "Where is David?" As the sun began to set at 5:45 in the afternoon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the search intensified. Volunteers from the community began to arrive, neighbors, friends from church, fellow war veterans of David's. In less than 1 hour, there were almost 50 people scouring every inch of the Reynolds farm and neighboring properties. At 6:30 in the afternoon, under the glow of lanterns and improvised spotlights, they made another disturbing discovery. At approximately 200 meters from the workshop, in the direction of the old Whitmore farm, a property abandoned since 1956, they found a trail. Not a clear trail, but subtle disturbances in the soil, broken branches, trampled grass, as if something or someone had been dragged. Sheriff Thompson ordered them to follow the trail. It led directly toward the Whitmore farm. The old place had deteriorated in the last 3 years. The main house was in ruins, broken windows reflecting the light from the lanterns like empty eyes. The barn was partially collapsed. The entire place had an atmosphere of
abandonment and decay that made even the most experienced officers feel a chill down their spine. They searched the Whitmore farm until 10 at night, but they found nothing except empty buildings and the heavy silence of a place long forgotten. No sign of David Reynolds, no clue about where he could be or what had happened to him. At 11 at night, Deputy Crawford made a final discovery that would send shockwaves through the community. In the barn of the Reynolds farm, hidden under a pile of hay in the most distant corner, he found David's military chest. The same chest that David had been organizing in the previous weeks, the same olive green metal box with his military inscription. But now it was empty, completely empty. All the medals, documents, photographs, letters, everything that David had kept so carefully had disappeared. And at the bottom of the chest, engraved with what appeared to be a key or knife, were 4 words that no one could understand. Silence protects us. The news of David Reynolds' disappearance spread through Cedar Falls like a fire in a dry summer harvest. On the morning of Friday, the 16th of October, the small town of approximately 20,000 inhabitants was in a state of collective shock. The Gazette, the local newspaper, published the story on the first page. Local war veteran disappears in mysterious circumstances. Sheriff Harold Thompson established a command center on the Reynolds farm itself. He summoned all available resources in Black Hawk County. On Friday morning, the search resumed with renewed force. More than 150 volunteers, including Korean War veterans who had served with David, scoured the entire area in a radius of 8 kilometers from the farm. They checked every barn, every woods, every stream, every abandoned structure. The Whitmore farm received special attention. The Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation sent 2 of its best detectives, Marcus Sullivan and James Porter. They spent 2 entire days examining every inch of that abandoned property, but they found exactly nothing. No sign of struggle, no evidence that David or anyone else had been there recently. The dark stains found in the workshop were sent to the state laboratory in Des Moines. On Tuesday, the 20th of October, the results came back. It was human blood, type O positive, David Reynolds' blood type, but the amount was small, approximately equivalent to a deep cut, not enough to indicate serious or fatal injuries. The phrase engraved at the bottom of the military chest, "Silence protects us," became the focus of intense speculation. What did it mean? Who had written it? David himself? Someone else? Sheriff Thompson consulted psychologists, linguists, even a history professor from the University of Northern Iowa. No one could provide a satisfactory explanation. Kathy Mitchell was devastated. She spent every day at the farm, helping Margaret, refusing to accept that David had simply disappeared. He would not leave, she insisted to anyone who would listen. Not without saying goodbye, not without explanation. David is not that kind of person. Something happened to him, something terrible. The investigation quickly developed multiple theories, each one more disturbing than the previous one. The first theory was the most obvious: crime. Perhaps David had surprised thieves or invaders on the property. Perhaps there had been a confrontation that ended badly. But this theory had problems. Nothing had been stolen. The house was intact. David's wallet containing $140 was found in his dresser. His truck was parked where it always was, keys in the ignition. If it were a robbery,
Why didn't the criminals take anything? The second theory was darker: suicide. David was a war veteran. He had seen horrors in Korea. Some officers suggested that perhaps David was suffering from what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder and decided to take his own life. Perhaps he walked to some distant, hidden place to die alone. But those who knew David vehemently rejected that idea. David was happy, Kathy insisted through tears. We were going to get married in 6 weeks. He was planning our future. He would not do this. The third theory was the most controversial: voluntary desertion. Perhaps David had had second thoughts about the marriage, about life in Cedar Falls, about taking over the family farm. Perhaps he simply ran away to start a new life elsewhere. But this theory also had glaring flaws. David loved his mother deeply and would never
Leave her in despair. And why take only the contents of his military chest? Why leave money, identification documents, everything else behind? A fourth theory emerged through whispers and bar conversations: criminal involvement. Some speculated that perhaps David was involved in something illegal, something that caught up with him. Drug trafficking, illegal gambling, even espionage were mentioned. But there was absolutely no evidence to support any of these allegations. David's record was impeccable. He was known precisely for his unwavering integrity. David's family was being destroyed by the disappearance. Margaret Reynolds, who had survived the Great Depression, World War II, the Korean War, seemed to age 10 years in 1 week. She refused to leave the farm, convinced that David would come home and expected to find her there waiting. She kept food warm on the stove every night, waiting to hear her son's footsteps on the porch. The Cedar Falls community responded with extraordinary support. The church organized weekly vigils. Neighbors took over the work on the Reynolds farm, ensuring that the cattle were fed, that the harvests were brought in before the first snow. A fund was established to help with the costs of the investigation. But as October gave way to November, and November brought the first snow of winter, the terrible reality began to settle in. David Reynolds had disappeared, leaving virtually no trace. And despite all efforts, despite all the technology available in 1959, despite the tireless dedication of law enforcement and the community, no one could answer the simplest and most anguishing question: what happened to David? The 27th of November 1959, the day that should have been David and Kathy's wedding, was the darkest day in Cedar Falls' recent history. Instead of a celebration of union, the church was filled with people mourning a loss they could not even properly name. Kathy wore the wedding dress that Margaret had sewn, sitting in the front pew of the church, crying silently. It was her way of saying she still believed, that she still hoped that David would return. But David Reynolds did not return. In 1965, 5 years after the disappearance, a drifter was arrested in Des Moines for petty crimes. During interrogation, he casually mentioned that he had passed through Cedar Falls in the autumn of 1959 and had seen something strange near a farm on rural Route 47. Detectives immediately traveled to interview him. The man's story was confused and contradictory. He claimed to have seen lights at the Whitmore farm late at night in mid-October, moving lights like lanterns. But when pressed for specific details, his memories were too vague to be useful. The lead led nowhere. In 1972, the Whitmore farm was finally sold to a lumber company. The barn and main house were demolished, the land leveled, trees planted. If there was any evidence hidden on that property, it was permanently destroyed or buried under layers of new soil and growing forest. Margaret Reynolds passed away in 1978 at 74 years old from heart failure, but those close to her knew it was really from a broken heart. She died without ever knowing what happened to her only son.
In her will, she left the farm to Kathy Mitchell with a note. To Kathy, who loved my son until the end, may this land bring you the peace I could never find. Kathy kept the farm for a few more years, but in 1983 she sold it. It was too painful to be there, surrounded by memories of a future that never happened. The property changed hands several times in the following decades, each new owner unaware of the tragedy that had occurred there. The original house was demolished in 1991, replaced by a modern house. The barn was rebuilt. The land itself was remodeled. But the memory persisted. Cedar Falls never forgot David Reynolds. Every few years, usually around the anniversary of the disappearance, the local newspaper would publish an article remembering the case. Still no answers. The David Reynolds mystery became a recurring headline. Older veterans told stories about him to younger ones. Local history teachers included the case in their classes as an example of unsolved mysteries of rural America. New theories emerged over the decades. In the 1980s, some speculated that David could have been a victim of an unknown serial killer operating in the region. An analysis of disappearances in the Midwest area between 1955 and 1965 revealed a possibly concerning pattern, but no definitive connection to David
could be established. In the 1990s, with the advent of the Internet, enthusiasts of unsolved mysteries began discussing the case in online forums. One particularly elaborate theory suggested that David had discovered something related to his experience in the Korean War, something classified that made him a target. But there was absolutely no evidence to support this conspiracy theory. What was most disturbing was the phrase engraved on the military chest, "Silence protects us." Those 4 words took on an almost mythical quality over the years. What did they mean? Was it a threat? A warning? A plea? And who was us? David and someone else, or something completely different? The farm where David disappeared eventually became something of a local legend among Cedar Falls teenagers. Inevitably, ghost stories emerged. People claimed to see a figure in a barn that no longer existed, hear tools being used in a workshop long demolished. But they were just stories, the kind of urban mythology that grows around unresolved tragedies. And then, 60 years after that cold October morning of 1959, an excavator plunged into the soil of a property marked for development, and it found something that had been buried so deeply, so carefully, that it survived 6 decades of change and forgetting. David Reynolds' military chest was about to reveal its secrets, but not the secrets anyone expected. It was the 16th of November, 2019. Winter was arriving again in Cedar Falls, temperatures dropping, the sky assuming that characteristic gray tone of November in the Midwest. John Martinez, a 43-year-old excavator operator, was working for the Morrison Construction Company, preparing the land for the new Riverview Estates condominium on rural Route 47. The property had changed so much over the years that few workers on site knew its history. Some of the older ones vaguely remembered that something had happened there decades ago, but the details were nebulous. For most, it was just another job, another lot of land to clear and prepare. John was working in the area behind where the old barn had stood. Morrison Construction had documents showing that old structures had been demolished there in the 1990s, and it was John's job to ensure that the soil was completely clean of any old foundations or debris before new construction began. It was 10:23 in the morning when the metal claws of the excavator hit something solid at 3 meters and 60 centimeters of depth. John felt the vibration reverberating through the controls. He knew that sensation. Rock, old concrete. He descended from the machine to investigate. What emerged from the compacted earth made John instinctively step back. It was a military chest of the type he had seen in Army surplus stores. Olive green metal, covered in rust and dirt from decades, but still structurally intact. And there, barely visible under the crust of time and earth, was an inscription.
Sergeant D.A. Reynolds, U.S. Army, 1953. John immediately called his supervisor, Thomas Crane. Thomas arrived 3 minutes later, out of breath. He looked at the chest and felt his stomach turn. Thomas was 56 years old. He had grown up in Cedar Falls, and he remembered the stories. Everyone who grew up in Cedar Falls in the 1960s or 70s knew the story of David Reynolds. "Do not touch anything else," Thomas ordered, his voice tense. "We are calling the police now." At 11:05 in the morning, officers from the Cedar Falls Police Department arrived at the site. At 11:30, detectives from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation were on their way. Noon, a complete forensic team had established a perimeter around the excavation site. The chest was carefully extracted from the soil. It was extraordinarily heavy for its size, suggesting it contained something substantial. But unlike the chest that had been found in the Reynolds barn in 1959, this one was locked with a corroded but still functional military padlock. Detective Sarah Chen, specialist in cold cases, who had taken on the Reynolds case as a personal project years before, was present. She was 39 years old, had moved to Iowa from California in 2010, and became fascinated by David's mystery when she began studying archived cases. She had interviewed everyone who was still alive and who had known David, including Kathy Mitchell, just a few months before her death. Sarah watched as forensic technicians worked meticulously to open the chest without destroying any
Potential evidence. It took 45 minutes. At 12:53 in the afternoon, the padlock was finally removed. The rusty hinges squeaked when the lid was slowly lifted. What was inside made even the most experienced investigators fall silent. The chest contained everything that had disappeared from that other chest in 1959. David's military medals, including his Purple Heart and Bronze Star, his honorable discharge papers, photographs of him with his fellow soldiers in Korea. But there was more, much more. There was a diary, a leather-bound diary that no one knew existed. Pages and pages in David's meticulous handwriting, dating from his service in Korea until October 1959. And there were letters, dozens of letters in unsent envelopes addressed to people in Cedar Falls, including his mother, Kathy, even Sheriff Thompson. And at the bottom of the chest, carefully wrapped in an oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture for 60 years, there was a Colt .45 revolver, a military model, completely clean, well-preserved, unfired, and beside it, a box of ammunition, untouched. But it was the envelope at the top of everything that made Sarah's heart race. A common white envelope with only 2 words written on it in cursive, "For Discovery." Detective Chen put on gloves and carefully opened the envelope. Inside there were 2 sheets of paper, both filled with David's handwriting. It was a letter, and when Sarah began to read, she realized that everything they thought they knew about David Reynolds' disappearance was about to be turned upside down. The letter began simply, "If you are reading this, then my worst fear has come true, and I ask your forgiveness for everything I was forced to do." David Reynolds' letter, perfectly preserved in the chest, buried for 60 years, was transcribed, analyzed by graphology experts to confirm authenticity, and finally made public in January of 2020. What it revealed was simultaneously enlightening and deeply disturbing. David wrote the letter on the night of the 14th of October, 1959, less than 24 hours before his disappearance. Each word was carefully chosen. Each sentence carried the weight of an impossible decision. In the letter, David explained that during his service in Korea, he and his platoon had been witnesses to something that the American Army desperately wanted to keep secret. He did not specify exactly what, using only the phrase, "We saw what our own side was capable of doing when no one was watching."
He mentioned that 3 members of his platoon had died in questionable circumstances in the years after the war. One in a car accident in 1956, another from an apparent suicide in 1957, a third had disappeared in 1958. David wrote that he had been contacted by someone who said they represented national security interests in early October of 1959. He was offered a choice: disappear voluntarily, assume a new identity in exchange for guarantee of safety for his family, or face consequences that would reach beyond me. "I cannot risk them hurting my mother or Kathy," David wrote. "I cannot risk them destroying the people I love for something I saw years ago. They told me that if I cooperated, if I simply disappeared without questioning, my family would be left in peace. If I fought, if I tried to expose what I know, everyone I love would suffer." David wrote that the plan was to make him disappear on the 15th of October. He would be taken during the day, transported to an unknown location, given a new identity. "They promise I will not be hurt," he wrote, "just removed, erased." But David had planned his own act of resistance. In the days prior to the disappearance, he had buried this chest containing all his military documentation and the diary where he recorded everything he knew. He had left the weapon as evidence that he was not going willingly, that he had means to defend himself, but chose not to fight to protect those he loved. "Silence protects us," David wrote, explaining the phrase he himself had engraved on the other chest. "We, those who know, we, those who saw, we remain in silence to protect those we love. But I leave this truth buried, waiting, because perhaps one day, when enough time has passed, when those who threatened us are no longer in power, someone will find this and will know that we were not simply cowards, that we did not run away, that we made the impossible choice that was given to us." The letter ended with words that would break the heart of anyone who read it. "Mother, please forgive your absence. Kathy, my love, please know that every second away from you will be a small death. But I go because if I stay, if I fight, you will pay the price. And I would rather live in exile than have your blood on my hands. I love you beyond words, and my greatest regret is that you will spend your lives without knowing the truth. Sorry, sorry, sorry." David's diary, filling an entire notebook of 200 pages, provided more details. He methodically documented specific events he had witnessed during the Korean War, incidents involving civilians, questionable command decisions, things that, if made public in 1959, at the height of the Cold War, could have caused significant international scandal. Detective Chen and her team spent months verifying the details in David's diary against declassified military records, interviewing military historians, consulting experts. The conclusion was disturbing. Everything David wrote was consistent with known but covered-up events from the Korean War. He had indeed witnessed things that the American Army desperately wanted to keep secret. The renewed investigation also discovered something extraordinary in the National Archives. Recently declassified records showed that the other 3 members of David's platoon, those he mentioned as having died in questionable circumstances, had all been under FBI surveillance in the years after the war. Their deaths, officially listed as accidental or self-inflicted, had reports with curious inconsistencies. But the most important question remained unanswered. What happened to David after the 15th of October, 1959? Had he really been taken and given a new identity? Was he still alive somewhere, living under a different name? Or had the promise of security been a lie, and David had been permanently silenced on that day? Detective Chen followed every possible lead. She consulted records of protected identities, witness protection programs, military relocation files. But David Reynolds, if he was still alive, had been erased so completely that no trace of him could be found. One possible clue emerged in March of 2020. An elderly man in a nursing home in Portland, Oregon, reading about the case in the newspapers, contacted the authorities. He claimed to have known a man in the 1970s, a man who called himself Dan Robbins, who had said strange things about having left behind an entire life in Iowa. But when investigators followed the lead, they discovered that Dan Robbins had died in 1994, and any evidence that could have linked him to David Reynolds had been lost in time. Analysis of the soil around where the chest was found revealed something intriguing. The earth had been disturbed, excavated, and refilled, not once but twice. Once in October 1959, presumably when David buried the chest, and again sometime between 1959 and 1965, based on geological analysis. Someone had returned. Someone had excavated near the location of the chest, but had not found it. Were they looking for it, trying to recover the evidence that David had left behind? Or was it something completely unrelated? The discovery of the chest brought some measure of closure for those who loved David, even decades after their deaths. Susan Hartley, David's classmate who was still alive at 92 years old, said through tears, "He did not abandon us. He did not run away. He sacrificed everything to protect us. That is the David I knew." But it also raised disturbing questions about power, secrecy, and how much the government was willing to do to protect classified information. How many other David Reynolds existed? How many other people were forced to choose between their lives and the safety of their families? Today, more than 65 years after that cold October morning when David Reynolds disappeared, the case remains technically unsolved. David's final fate, where he ended up, if he lived days or decades after that 15th of October 1959, remains unknown. The Cedar Falls Police Department and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation keep the case open. Detective Sarah Chen, now promoted to lieutenant, continues working on it when time permits. She has followed hundreds of leads, interviewed dozens of people, searched through thousands of pages of declassified documents. But David Reynolds, or whoever he became, remains lost in time. David's diary was partially published in 2021, with certain sections still classified for national security reasons. It became an important document for military historians studying the Korean War and the aftermath of war for
Veterans. It also served as a somber reminder of the invisible costs of conflict. The property on rural Route 47 where David disappeared was finally developed. The Riverview Estates condominium was completed in 2021, but the developers, in recognition of the site's history, established a small memorial, a simple bronze plaque mounted on a stone in memory of Sergeant David Andrew Reynolds, 1931 to 1959. War hero, dedicated son, loving fiancé, who made the ultimate sacrifice, chose exile to protect those he loved. His truth, buried for 60 years, finally came to light. May we never forget those who silently suffered to protect others. The weapon found in the chest was analyzed extensively. It was loaded, but never fired. Forensic experts confirmed that David could have used it to defend himself, but chose not to. It was his last statement of peaceful resistance, his refusal to violence, even when forced into an impossible situation. Kathy Mitchell, who passed away in 1998 at 64 years old, never knew the truth about what happened to David. She lived 59 years without knowing that the man she loved had not abandoned her, but rather made the greatest imaginable sacrifice for her. Susan Hartley said, "It breaks my heart that Kathy never knew. She deserved to know that his love for her was so deep that he chose to lose everything, even her, to keep her safe." Margaret Reynolds also never knew the truth.
She spent 19 years after David's disappearance waiting for answers that never came. But those who knew her in the last years of her life said she had an unshakable conviction. David did not leave us by choice. My son was a good man. If he left, he had a reason, and one day we will know what it was. Margaret was right. 60 years later, we finally know. But some questions remain and may never be answered. Did David survive? Did he live a long life under a different identity, carrying the weight of his memories, thinking every night about his mother and Kathy, waiting for the day when he could return home? Or was the promise of security a cruel lie, and David was permanently silenced shortly after being taken on that October day? Were there moments when he almost returned? Were there nights when he almost picked up the phone, almost wrote a letter, almost risked his family's safety just to let them know he was alive? Or did he maintain his military discipline until the end, silent and obedient, even in exile? And those words he engraved, "Silence protects us," were they true? Did silence protect Margaret and Kathy, or was it simply what David needed to believe to justify the impossible sacrifice he was forced to make?